Congratulations, you absolute menace. You've broken roughly 47 laws just by waking up this morning, and you don't even know it. An entire state once legally tried to change the value of pi to 3.2 because math was bullying them. Jailed for kissing your own wife on a Sunday and wearing pants in public like some kind of saint. America wrote 111 laws, so brain-dead, I'm convinced the Founding Fathers were doing this on a dare. And by the end of this video, you'll be looking at your own grandma like, ma'am, you were a felon. So smash that like button before the 1600s Puritan police kick your door in, and subscribe, or don't, and live the rest of your life knowing a ghost in a powdered wig is deeply disappointed in you. 1. Christmas was straight up illegal in Massachusetts back in 1659, and the Puritans were dead serious about it. They thought the holiday was too rowdy, too Catholic, and way too much fun for their liking. Boston lawmakers slapped a 5-shilling fine on anyone caught feasting, exchanging gifts, or skipping work that day. Constables actually patrolled neighborhoods sniffing around for roast goose and suspicious cheer. The ban stretched on for 22 long years before lawmakers finally caved. Even after that, Boston public schools stayed open on Christmas Day all the way until 1870. The Grinch had absolutely nothing on these guys. 2. Mailing a biology textbook could land you in federal prison back in 1873, thanks to one very angry postal inspector. Anthony Comstock was a cranky moral crusader who convinced Congress to ban anything he personally considered obscene through the mail. That definition somehow included anatomy books, medical pamphlets, and private letters between licensed doctors. Comstock proudly bragged about destroying 15 tons of printed material during his long, bizarre career. Doctors got dragged into court for simply explaining how the human body actually functions. Authors started hiding their manuscripts in attics out of pure fear. Meanwhile, Comstock strutted around feeling like a Victorian superhero, saving America. 3. American women could not legally vote in federal elections until 1920. Which is genuinely embarrassing for a country built on representation. Suffragists marched, picketed the White House, got tossed in jail, and went on brutal hunger strikes for decades. Officials force-fed protesters through tubes and called them hysterical troublemakers needing discipline. Susan B. Anthony famously voted illegally in 1872 just to make a loud point. The 19th Amendment finally passed after Tennessee approved it by a single vote, cast by a young lawmaker whose mother told him to do the right thing. One mom basically saved democracy that day. 4. Married colonial women legally vanished the second they said I do, which sounds dramatic but is literally true. Under a charming little doctrine called coverture, a wife stopped being a separate person in the eyes of the law entirely. Her husband owned her property, her wages, her clothes, and even any kids they had together. She could not sign contracts, sue anyone in court, or own a business under her own name. If she earned money sewing dresses, that cash legally belonged to him. Husbands could discipline wives physically within reason, which courts defined extremely generously. Basically, marriage turned women into legally invisible ghosts. 5. The 1692 Salem witch trials actually accepted dreams as legitimate courtroom evidence, which is somehow real history. Judges allowed something called spectral evidence, meaning if you dreamed your neighbor was a witch, that counted. Teenage girls flopped around in court screaming that invisible specters were pinching them right then and there. 19 people swung from the gallows based on this absolute nonsense, and one poor old man got crushed under heavy stones. Even dogs got executed for allegedly being witch accomplices, which is a wild detail nobody mentions. The judges later apologized publicly, but apologies do not exactly unhang anyone. Massachusetts owes everyone a serious do-over. 6. Indiana lawmakers nearly redefined the value of pi to 3.2 in 1897 through actual legislation. A doctor named Edward Goodwin claimed he had squared the circle, which is mathematically impossible, but nobody told him. He convinced his state representative to introduce Bill 246, generously offering Indiana free use of his discovery. The House passed it unanimously because nobody there understood basic geometry, apparently. The bill was heading toward easy Senate approval when Purdue math professor Clarence Waldo happened to be visiting that day. He overheard the debate, nearly fainted, and quickly coached senators on why this was insane. Math survived by sheer luck. 7. Marrying someone of a different race was still a crime in 16 American states until 1967, which is uncomfortably recent. Mildred and Richard Loving, an interracial Virginia couple, got arrested in their own bedroom at 2 in the morning. Police literally barged in, hoping to catch them having sex, which was also illegal apparently. They were sentenced to a full year in prison, unless they agreed to leave Virginia for 25 years straight. The Lovings fought all the way to the Supreme Court, which finally struck the law down. Their last name being Loving honestly feels like fate writing the most poetic possible ending. 8. Teaching an enslaved person how to write their own name was a crime in South Carolina starting in 1740. The Negro Act slapped a 100-pound fine on anyone caught sharing literacy, which was massive money back then. Lawmakers panicked because writing meant enslaved people could forge travel passes and escape to freedom. Reading the Bible was sometimes allowed, but only the parts about obedience and never anything inspiring. Enslaved people still learned secretly in barns, kitchens, and woods using stolen scraps of paper. Frederick Douglass later said literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom, which terrified slaveholders for very obvious reasons. 9. Banks could legally refuse women credit cards without a husband co-signing until the year 1974, which is wild. A successful female surgeon making $300,000 yearly still needed her unemployed husband to sign off. Single women, divorced women, and widows were basically treated like financial children incapable of basic decisions. One woman famously walked into a bank, got rejected, then watched her teenage son get instantly approved. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act finally fixed this disaster after years of furious feminist organizing nationwide. Before that, banks asked women about birth control plans before approving loans. Imagine explaining your menstrual cycle to qualify for a mortgage. 10. Quaker preacher Mary Dyer was hanged on Boston Common in 1660 simply for preaching her faith publicly. Massachusetts Puritans absolutely despised Quakers and made returning to the colony after banishment a death sentence. Mary kept coming back anyway because she believed religious freedom was worth literally dying for. Authorities exiled her 3 separate times, hoping she would finally take the hint and stay gone forever. She walked calmly to the gallows, refusing to recant a single word of her beliefs that morning. Her execution horrified England so much that the king personally ordered Massachusetts to stop hanging Quakers immediately. Mary basically won by losing everything. 11. Captain Thomas Kemble got locked into wooden stocks in 1656 for the heinous crime of kissing his own wife. The poor man had just returned home after 3 brutal years away at sea, fighting through rough waters. He spotted his wife waiting on their doorstep and gave her a quick kiss like any normal husband would. Unfortunately for Kemble, it happened to be Sunday, and Massachusetts banned public affection on the Sabbath strictly. Neighbors reported him within minutes, and constables hauled him away to the town square for punishment. He spent 2 humiliating hours getting laughed at by passing Bostonians, while his wife watched in disbelief. 12. Mince pies were banned in New Haven Colony starting in 1656 because Puritans considered them suspiciously Catholic treats. The dessert had medieval English roots tied to Christmas celebrations, which immediately made it religious enemy number 1. Lawmakers genuinely believed eating spiced meat pie during winter holidays meant secretly supporting the Pope and old traditions. The Blue Laws targeted anything festive or flavorful that reminded settlers of their fancy old country celebrations. Bakers caught selling mince pies faced steep fines and stern public lectures about endangering their immortal souls forever. Families hid pies under floorboards and whispered while eating them like they were running a dessert speakeasy. 13. Pennsylvania colonists could get fined heavily for casually dropping a swear word back in the year 1682. William Penn personally wrote the frame of government, treating profanity like a genuine moral emergency requiring quick intervention. First-time offenders paid a small fine, but repeat cussers actually got tossed into jail for reflection. Quakers believed taking the Lord's name in vain damaged your soul and the entire colony's spiritual reputation. Constables eavesdropped on conversations hoping to catch farmers, blurting out something colorful after stepping in fresh manure. Sailors visiting Philadelphia Harbor were apparently the worst offenders, swearing constantly while unloading goods at the busy docks. 14. The Logan Act of 1798 made it a federal felony for regular Americans to negotiate with any foreign government. Dr. George Logan had traveled to France hoping to personally prevent a war, which annoyed Congress immensely back home. Lawmakers basically created an entire criminal statute just to punish one specific guy for being too independently helpful. The law is still sitting on the books today, waiting patiently for someone to actually get convicted under it. In over 200 years, nobody has ever been successfully prosecuted despite plenty of dramatic attempts by furious politicians. Threats fly around constantly whenever rivals chat with foreign leaders, but actual charges somehow never stick in court. 15. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 became the first American law banning an entire ethnic group from immigrating here. Congress decided Chinese laborers were stealing jobs after happily using them to build the Transcontinental Railroad first. The law blocked Chinese workers from entering, naturalizing, or reuniting with their own families still back home. Men already living here got stuck unable to bring wives over, creating bachelor communities that lasted decades. Immigration officers interrogated arrivals for hours, demanding wildly specific details about ancestral villages and family rice paddies. The act stayed in force until 1943, when China became a wartime ally and the embarrassment finally hit Congress. 16. Virginia decided in 1662 that a child's enslaved status would follow whoever the mother happened to be biologically. This flipped centuries of English common law, which had traditionally passed status down through the father's bloodline instead. The change was no accident, since enslavers wanted to legally guarantee ownership of children fathered through assault and coercion. Mixed-race children born from white fathers and enslaved mothers automatically became property of the plantation owner forever. The law turned reproductive violence into a profitable business model for slaveholders across the entire American South region. Generations of children inherited bondage purely because of who carried them, regardless of who their actual father was. 17. Myra Bradwell was denied a law license by the United States Supreme Court in 1873 simply for being female. She had passed the Illinois bar exam easily and knew the law better than most male attorneys around her. Justices ruled that women's delicate nature unfit them for the harsh confrontational world of courtroom advocacy work. One judge wrote that the natural timidity of women made them obviously unsuitable for legal careers permanently and completely. Bradwell ran a successful legal newspaper anyway, and basically built Chicago's entire legal community from her own dining room. She finally got her license in 1890, 20 years late, after lawmakers eventually felt embarrassed enough to relent. 18. Connecticut made it illegal for married couples to use birth control in their own bedrooms until the year 1965. The 1879 Comstock-style law treated contraception like dangerous contraband, even between a husband and his own wife. Pharmacists could not legally sell condoms, diaphragms, or pills to anyone for any reason whatsoever back then. Doctors faced prosecution for simply discussing family planning options, with married patients quietly seeking medical advice privately. Estelle Griswold opened a Planned Parenthood clinic specifically hoping to get arrested and challenge the absurd, outdated law. Her plan worked perfectly when the Supreme Court finally struck the statute down in Griswold v. Connecticut nationally. 19. The federal government slapped a tax on rich Americans in 1894, only to watch the Supreme Court strike it down. Justices ruled the income tax unconstitutional because it was not properly apportioned among states according to population counts. Wealthy industrialists celebrated wildly, popping champagne while ordinary workers wondered who exactly would fund the federal government now. Congress fumed for 19 long years before finally passing the 16th Amendment to overturn the embarrassing decision permanently. Ratification in 1913 made income tax legal again, much to the absolute horror of billionaires across the entire nation. Tax accountants basically became a brand new profession overnight, and they have never stopped multiplying ever since then. 20. Teaching evolution became an actual crime in Tennessee, starting in 1925 thanks to the bizarre Butler Act passing easily. High school teacher John Scopes deliberately violated the law to challenge it, and the Scopes monkey trial exploded nationally. Famous lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes against three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan in the small courtroom. Reporters mobbed the tiny town of Dayton, broadcasting the trial live nationwide on the brand-new radio technology. Darrow brutally cross-examined Bryan about whether Jonah literally lived inside a whale belly for 3 full days straight. Scopes got fined $100, but the law stayed around until 1967, embarrassing Tennessee for decades after. 21. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 turned ordinary Northerners into criminals for simply feeding a hungry runaway at their door. Federal marshals could legally force any citizen to help capture escaped enslaved people on demand without question. Refusing to participate meant heavy fines and possible jail time, even for devout abolitionists with serious moral objections. Suspected runaways got no jury trial and no right to testify on their own behalf in any court. Commissioners earned $10 for ruling someone enslaved, but only $5 for ruling them free, which was suspicious. The law basically weaponized the entire North into a giant unpaid slave-catching operation for the wealthy South. 22. Massachusetts passed the Old Deluder Satan Act in 1647, requiring towns of 50 families to hire a schoolteacher immediately. Puritans genuinely believed Satan himself was personally working hard to keep colonists ignorant of Holy Scripture forever. Reading the Bible was considered the ultimate weapon against demonic influence sneaking into innocent New England communities. Larger towns of 100 families had to build entire grammar schools, preparing boys for Harvard College admission. The law accidentally created the first public education system in American history while trying to defeat the devil. Generations of literate Americans owe their reading skills to Puritan paranoia about Lucifer corrupting their young children spiritually. 23. Plymouth Colony executed 16-year-old Thomas Granger in 1642 for the disturbing crime of bestiality with farm animals. The teenage servant got caught in the act with a mare, which horrified the entire Puritan settlement deeply. Authorities held a proper trial with witnesses, and Granger confessed to relations with cows, goats, and even turkeys. Governor William Bradford personally documented every grim detail in his famous colonial history journal for posterity somehow. The animals involved got executed first right in front of Granger before he himself faced the hanging rope. Plymouth followed strict Old Testament law literally, meaning the livestock had to die as biblically required accomplices apparently. 24. The Sedition Act of 1798 made it illegal to publicly criticize the federal government or President John Adams personally. Newspaper editors got tossed into jail for printing jokes, opinions, or unflattering nicknames about powerful politicians in office. Congressman Matthew Lyons served 4 months in prison for writing that Adams had a ridiculous pomp of office. Federalists used the law to silence Jeffersonian Republicans, basically criminalizing political disagreement during a fragile young republic period. Thomas Jefferson called the act a complete violation of free speech and pardoned everyone convicted after winning election. The whole disaster taught Americans that criminalizing criticism backfires spectacularly, though politicians somehow keep forgetting that important lesson regularly. 25. New York passed the anti-mask law in 1845, specifically to stop angry tenant farmers from disguising themselves during rent revolts. Hudson Valley farmers had been dressing as Native Americans called Calico Indians and ambushing landlord rent collectors violently. The anti-rent war featured face paint, sheepskin masks, and tin horn signals warning neighbors about approaching sheriff deputies arriving. Lawmakers panicked and banned 3 or more masked people gathering in public spaces throughout the entire state. The law accidentally outlawed Halloween for a century until New York finally exempted costume parties in the modern era. Farmers basically invented anonymous protest tactics that scared landlords enough to inspire America's first dedicated anti-masking law. 26. Oregon entered the Union in 1859 with a state constitution explicitly banning black people from living within its borders. Free black settlers caught residing in Oregon faced public whippings every 6 months until they finally left the state. The exclusion clause stayed technically in the Constitution until voters finally removed the embarrassing language in 1926 officially. Lawmakers wanted Oregon to be a whites-only paradise, free from both slavery and black people existing entirely there. The state attracted settlers specifically promising racial purity, which is a horrifying founding mission to advertise publicly anywhere. Oregon's progressive reputation today seriously clashes with this deeply ugly origin story that most Americans never actually learned about. 27. California slapped a $20 monthly tax on non-white miners starting in 1850 during the famous gold rush. The foreign miners. Tax specifically targeted Mexican, Chinese, and Chilean prospectors flooding into California seeking quick fortune and freedom. $20 monthly was crushing money back then, basically wiping out any profits these miners actually managed to earn. Tax collectors roamed the mining camps demanding payment, sometimes beating or murdering miners who could not produce cash immediately. The law was rebranded several times to keep targeting Chinese miners, specifically as Mexican workers eventually left the diggings. California essentially funded its early state budget through racist extortion of immigrants doing the actual backbreaking gold mining labor. 28. The Expatriation Act of 1907 stripped American citizenship from any woman who dared marry a foreign man legally. American-born women suddenly became foreigners in their own homeland the moment they said yes at the altar. Even women whose husbands later naturalized often struggled getting their original citizenship restored through the messy bureaucratic system. One woman lost her American citizenship for marrying a British man and could not vote in her own country. The law assumed wives automatically absorbed their husband's nationality, which sounds romantic, but was actually horrifyingly inconvenient legally. Congress finally repealed most of the act in 1922, though some discriminatory provisions lingered for years afterward, causing ongoing problems. 29. Native Americans could be arrested for performing traditional religious dances under the Indian Religious Crimes Code until the year 1978. Federal agents banned the sun dance, the ghost dance, and countless sacred ceremonies practiced for thousands of years previously. Tribal leaders caught participating faced jail time, withheld rations, or forced relocation away from their own ancestral homelands. The Bureau of Indian Affairs basically tried erasing entire spiritual traditions through bureaucratic criminalization and aggressive cultural suppression tactics. Elders secretly taught ceremonies to children in hidden locations, preserving traditions through generations despite enormous personal legal risk. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act finally legalized these practices, though damage to cultural continuity took decades to begin healing. 30. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 forced citizens to officially register their race and criminalized racial passing across the entire state. The law recognized only two categories, white and colored, with white meaning literally zero non-European ancestry detected anywhere. Registrar Walter Plecker obsessively hunted down anyone he suspected of passing, destroying birth certificates and rewriting family histories aggressively. Native Americans got reclassified as colored, erasing tribal identities across Virginia through pure pen strokes by one obsessive bureaucrat. Couples could not marry across racial lines, and lying about ancestry on government forms became a serious felony offense. Plecker's reign lasted decades, and the damage to Virginia tribal recognition continues affecting communities seeking federal acknowledgement even today. 31. Communion wine basically became illegal across America when the 18th Amendment banned alcohol nationwide starting in 1920. Catholic and Jewish congregations got special religious exemptions, but Protestant churches mostly switched to grape juice during services awkwardly. Bootleggers immediately filled the demand gap, and organized crime exploded into a billion-dollar industry almost overnight nationwide. Speakeasies popped up everywhere, with secret passwords and hidden doorways turning ordinary basements into glamorous illegal nightclub destinations. Al Capone allegedly earned $60 million yearly from smuggling, basically becoming Chicago's unofficial alcohol king during the entire dry decade. Prohibition ended in 1933 after Americans collectively decided sobriety was significantly worse than gangsters running their neighborhoods openly. 32. Mormon men suddenly became federal felons in 1882 when Congress passed the Edmunds Act, targeting plural marriage throughout Utah Territory. Thousands of husbands got disenfranchised, jailed, or forced into hiding to avoid federal marshals hunting them aggressively across the territory. Wives were dragged into court and ordered to testify against their own husbands about their domestic living arrangements directly. Mormon leaders went underground for years, communicating through coded letters while raising families in safe houses scattered across the region. The church finally issued the Manifesto in 1890, officially ending polygamy so Utah could eventually achieve statehood without ongoing resistance. Federal prosecution basically forced an entire religion to restructure its core doctrine within a single, very dramatic generation. 33. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs landed in federal prison for 10 years over a single anti-war speech in 1918. He had publicly criticized American involvement in World War I during an Ohio rally, calling the conflict capitalist greed openly. Prosecutors argued his words discouraged military recruitment, which somehow qualified as actual espionage under the wildly broad new federal law. Debs ran for president from his prison cell in 1920 and received nearly 1 million votes from sympathetic Americans nationwide. President Warren Harding eventually commuted his sentence in 1921, and Debs walked free after serving nearly 3 full years. The same law is still being used today to prosecute whistleblowers and journalists, showing its lasting troubling legacy. 34. Being gay was a felony in every single American state until Illinois finally repealed its sodomy law in the year 1962. Gay men and lesbians faced prison sentences, forced psychiatric treatment, and electroshock therapy for simply existing as themselves quietly. Police regularly raided bars, parks, and private homes, arresting people based on appearance, mannerisms, or suspected sexual orientation alone. Newspapers published names and addresses of those arrested, destroying careers, marriages, and entire family relationships in single brutal days. Some defendants were involuntarily committed to mental hospitals, where doctors performed lobotomies hoping to cure their supposed terrible affliction. The Supreme Court did not fully strike down sodomy laws nationwide until Lawrence versus Texas in the year 2003. 35. Voting got Susan B. Anthony arrested in November 1872, and the federal government fined her $100 afterward. She had walked into a Rochester polling place, presented her case to confused election inspectors, and cast her ballot confidently. Federal marshals showed up at her home 2 weeks later, awkwardly arresting the famous activist in her own parlor. Anthony refused to pay the fine, daring the judge to actually jail her for protesting taxation without representation publicly. The judge refused to imprison her, which prevented Anthony from appealing the case to the Supreme Court for review. She famously declared resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, then continued organizing women voters until her death years later. 36. Chinese women were effectively banned from immigrating to America under the Page Act of 1875 through outrageous assumptions. Immigration officers automatically presumed Chinese women were prostitutes and interrogated them aggressively about their marriage and moral character standards. The vague criteria gave officers complete discretion to reject basically any Chinese woman trying to enter the country legally. Chinese men already working here could not bring wives over, creating bachelor communities lasting for several painful generations afterward. The law devastated Chinese-American family formation and shaped the entire demographic structure of Chinatowns nationwide for decades. Lawmakers framed the act as protecting public morals while actually engineering deliberate racial exclusion through gendered immigration enforcement policies. 37. Forced sterilization became perfectly constitutional after the Supreme Court ruled in Buck versus Bell back in 1927 through one horrifying decision. Carrie Buck, a young Virginia woman, got sterilized against her will because authorities labeled her supposedly mentally deficient unfairly. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the famous line that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, summing up the awful ruling. States rushed to pass eugenic sterilization laws, eventually sterilizing roughly 60,000 Americans considered unfit for reproduction over decades. Nazi Germany later cited the Buck decision while developing their own eugenic sterilization programs, targeting various populations across Europe brutally. The Supreme Court has never officially overturned Buck versus Bell, meaning the awful precedent technically still stands in American law. 38. farm workers and domestic servants were deliberately excluded from the Social Security Act of 1935, blocking retirement and unemployment benefits permanently. This carve-out cut roughly 65% of black workers nationwide out of the new social safety net entirely. Southern Democrats demanded the exclusion, refusing to vote for any bill that would extend benefits to black workers equally. President Franklin Roosevelt accepted the racist compromise because he needed Southern votes to pass his broader New Deal agenda quickly. Coverage gradually expanded over subsequent decades, but the original exclusion shaped wealth gaps between black and white families generationally. The supposedly universal program was carefully designed to leave the poorest American workers entirely outside its protective benefit structure. 39. Playing checkers across racial lines was actually illegal in Jim Crow, Alabama, which sounds absurd but is genuinely real history. Lawmakers feared even harmless board games might somehow encourage racial mixing, friendship, or worst of all, eventual romantic relationships forming. The statute joined hundreds of similarly absurd segregation laws regulating drinking fountains, libraries, ambulances, and even cemetery burial plots. Birmingham specifically codified the checkers ban into its city code, treating board games like genuine public safety threats. Violators faced fines and possible jail time, though enforcement was honestly less common than for more serious segregation crimes. The law captures how Jim Crow obsessively policed even the smallest harmless interactions between Americans across racial lines daily. 40. Freed slaves in Mississippi were forced to sign yearly labor contracts under the brutal black codes of 1865 or face arrest. Newly emancipated black workers basically got handed a harsh choice between plantation labor and prison chain gang sentences immediately. Anyone caught without a written contract could be hired out to white employers, often their former enslavers, shockingly enough. The codes restricted black ownership of guns, gathering in groups, and even renting land in certain urban areas legally. Mississippi lawmakers basically tried recreating slavery under different names within months of the Civil War, officially ending nationwide. Congress eventually responded with the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction policies, though the codes inspired the eventual rise of Jim Crow. 41. Federal jobs had been openly sold for cash for nearly a century before the Pendleton Act of 1882 finally cleaned things up. Politicians treated government positions like personal birthday gifts, handing them out to friends, donors, and loyal campaign workers everywhere. The spoil system reached absurd peaks where postmasters, customs officials, and even ambassadors paid bribes to secure their positions. President James Garfield got assassinated in 1881 by Charles Guiteau. A disgruntled job seeker denied his expected federal appointment. The shocking murder finally pushed Congress to create a real merit-based civil service system, requiring actual competitive examinations. Reform took years to fully implement, but Garfield's death basically forced America to professionalize its corrupt patronage system. 42. Italian immigrants in New York City became the secret target of the Sullivan Act of 1911, which required concealed handgun permits. Tammany Hall politician Big Tim Sullivan pushed the law specifically to disarm Italian immigrants flooding into lower Manhattan neighborhoods. Police had complete discretion over who received permits, predictably approving wealthy white applicants while rejecting immigrants and minorities constantly. Italian Americans got arrested by the thousands for carrying small pistols they had used unbothered just months earlier legally. The law remained on the books for over a century, becoming a model for restrictive permit systems across multiple states. Sullivan himself reportedly died under suspicious circumstances years later, possibly murdered by enemies he had personally helped disarm earlier. 43. All theater performances were banned in Massachusetts from 1750 until 1793 because Puritans considered acting deeply sinful entertainment. Lawmakers genuinely believed plays corrupted public morals, encouraged laziness, and somehow lured honest citizens away from productive farming work. Traveling theater companies got chased out of Boston repeatedly, performing in secret barns or moving south to friendlier colonies quickly. Wealthy Bostonians sometimes attended illegal performances disguised as moral lectures, paying admission to hear sermons that suspiciously resembled actual plays. The ban finally lifted after the Revolution, when Bostonians decided independence should probably include the freedom to enjoy Shakespeare publicly. Massachusetts went from banning theater entirely to becoming home to America's oldest continuously operating theater within just a few decades. 44. Tribal land worth 90 million acres got transferred to white settlers through the Dawes Act of 1887, devastating native communities permanently. The law broke up communal reservations into individual family allotments, then sold the leftover surplus to non-native homesteaders cheaply. Native families received small parcels often unsuitable for farming, while the most fertile land went directly to white buyers immediately. Government agents pressured native heads of household to accept the deal, sometimes through outright fraud and intimidation tactics openly. Within 50 years, tribes had lost roughly two-thirds of their already shrunken reservation territory through this devastating bureaucratic process. The Dawes Act stands as one of the largest land transfers in American history, accomplished entirely through paperwork and signatures. 45. Executive Order 9066 forced 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps in 1942 without any trial whatsoever. Families had just days to sell homes, businesses, and belongings before being shipped to remote desert camps surrounded by barbed wire. Two-thirds of those imprisoned were American-born citizens who had committed absolutely no crimes against their own country. Children grew up behind guard towers, while parents lost everything they had built through decades of hard immigrant labor. The Supreme Court upheld internment in Korematsu versus United States, a decision now widely considered among the worst rulings ever. President Reagan finally signed reparations in 1988, paying $20,000 to each survivor, along with an official formal apology. 46. American citizenship was legally restricted to free white persons under the Naturalization Act of 1790, the very first immigration law passed. Congress decided within months of founding the country that only white European immigrants could become naturalized American citizens going forward. Black people, Asian immigrants, and Native Americans were all explicitly excluded from accessing the basic rights of citizenship through naturalization. The racial requirement stayed on the books for over 150 years, slowly getting chipped away through various amendments. Asian immigrants finally gained naturalization rights in 1952, ending more than a century of explicit racial exclusion from American citizenship completely. The founders literally wrote whiteness into citizenship law, within the new republic's very first year of legislative business. 47. Catholics in Maryland had to pay double property taxes starting in 1704 until the American Revolution finally ended the injustice. The colony had originally been founded as a Catholic refuge under Lord Baltimore, offering religious tolerance to persecuted minorities seeking sanctuary. Protestant settlers eventually flipped the political balance, then immediately started passing laws punishing the Catholics who had welcomed them generously. Catholic churches got banned from operating openly, and Catholic schools had to be hidden in private homes secretly. The double tax basically funded the Anglican Church using Catholic money, which is breathtaking hypocrisy by any historical standard. Maryland Catholics finally got equal rights during the Revolution, after fighting for a country that had treated them like criminals. 48. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts in 1635 for the unforgivable crime of preaching religious tolerance to his fellow Puritans. He argued the government had no business punishing people for their religious beliefs, which scandalized Boston authorities completely. Williams fled south during a brutal winter, nearly dying before Wampanoag people sheltered him and saved his frozen life. He founded Rhode Island in 1636 as America's first colony guaranteeing genuine religious freedom for all peaceful residents equally. Quakers, Jews, Catholics, and atheists all settled there, creating a wildly diverse community by harsh 17th century colonial standards. Williams basically invented the American concept of separation of church and state, despite getting kicked out for it first. 49. Masters received legal absolute power over enslaved people under the Carolina Constitution of 1670, which philosopher John Locke helped author. The document explicitly granted slaveholders complete authority over the bodies, labor, and lives of enslaved Africans without any legal limits. Locke is famous for writing about natural rights and human freedom, yet personally invested in the Royal African Company. The contradiction shaped Carolina society for centuries, as slaveholders cited Locke's Constitution to justify increasingly brutal punishments and total control. Enslaved people had no legal standing to bring cases, testify against whites, or own property of any kind whatsoever. The Enlightenment philosopher most associated with human liberty basically helped design one of history's most brutal legal slavery systems. 50. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 banned racial discrimination in hotels, trains, and theaters before the Supreme Court killed it in 1883. The law was a final Reconstruction-era attempt to guarantee Black Americans equal access to public accommodations across the entire country. Black travelers briefly enjoyed protections against being kicked out of restaurants, denied train tickets, or refused theater admission anywhere. The Supreme Court then ruled Congress had no power to regulate private business discrimination, gutting the entire law instantly. Justice John Marshall Harlan famously dissented, predicting the decision would unleash decades of Jim Crow segregation across America. He was completely right, and similar protections did not return until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nearly a century later. 51. Talking back to your dad could legally get you executed in Massachusetts under the Body of Liberties passed in 1641. The colony made being a rebellious son over 16 years old an official capital offense punishable by hanging. Parents had to formally complain to authorities, and the son had to be considered stubborn beyond all reasonable correction. No teenager was ever actually executed under the law, but the threat probably terrified plenty of mouthy colonial boys quiet. Puritans took the biblical commandment to honor thy father and mother extremely literally, codifying scripture directly into criminal statute. 52. Worshipping any god besides the Christian one became a capital offense in Connecticut, starting in 1642 under the colony's brutal code. The law listed 12 specific capital crimes, including blasphemy, witchcraft, and serving any deity other than the approved Puritan version. Religious freedom basically meant freedom to worship exactly the way the local congregational church told you to worship weekly. Suspected idol worshippers faced trials where flimsy gossip and neighbor accusations counted as serious legitimate courtroom evidence against them. Connecticut's founders basically created a religious police state, which is wild considering descendants love bragging about Yankee tolerance today. 53. Maine outlawed every single alcohol sale within its borders in 1851, becoming the first statewide prohibition in American history. Reformer Neal Dow pushed the law through, earning the nickname Napoleon of Temperance for his obsessive anti-alcohol crusading across New England. Bootleggers immediately swarmed in, smuggling rum from Canada and selling whiskey hidden inside fake medicine bottles labeled as cough syrup. Riots broke out in Portland in 1855 when Dow himself got accused of secretly stockpiling alcohol in City Hall illegally. He ordered militia to fire on the angry crowd, killing one rioter and basically destroying his political career overnight. 54. San Francisco tried segregating Japanese children into separate schools in 1907, accidentally triggering a serious international incident with Japan immediately. The school board ordered 93 Japanese American students into the Chinese segregated school, which infuriated Japan's government deeply. Japan was a rising military power fresh off defeating Russia, and Tokyo demanded Washington fix the diplomatic mess quickly. President Theodore Roosevelt personally intervened, summoning San Francisco officials to the White House for extremely uncomfortable negotiations. The gentleman's agreement ended the segregation order in exchange for Japan voluntarily limiting laborer emigration to America going forward. 55. State laws openly preferred men over women as estate administrators until the Supreme Court finally struck them down in 1971. Sally and Cecil Reed were separated parents whose teenage son tragically died, leaving behind a small estate worth $900. Idaho law automatically chose Cecil simply because he was male, despite Sally being equally qualified and available locally. Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued the case, her first major gender discrimination victory in her famous legal career. The justices unanimously ruled the law unconstitutional, establishing that gender-based discrimination required serious constitutional scrutiny going forward. 56. New Jersey women actually voted legally from 1776 until 1807, before the state stripped that right away in a sudden flip. The original state constitution gave the vote to all inhabitants meeting property requirements, accidentally including women and even free black residents. Single property-owning women cast ballots for 30 years, scandalizing neighboring states and earning constant ridicule from male politicians elsewhere. Lawmakers finally rewrote the law in 1807, restricting voting to white male citizens only after a contested local election dispute. New Jersey pioneered American women's suffrage by accident, then erased it from history through one quick legislative maneuver. 57. Sojourner. Truth sued a slaveholder in 1828 and won the return of her young son sold illegally into Alabama slavery. Her 5-year-old boy Peter had been sold across state lines, which violated New York's gradual emancipation law completely. Truth was a recently freed black woman with no formal education, no money, and basically no powerful allies supporting her case. She walked into a county courthouse anyway, filed paperwork against a wealthy white slaveholder, and demanded her child back immediately. The court actually ruled in her favor, making her one of the first black women in American history to win such cases. 58. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 ruled that no black person, free or enslaved, could ever become an American citizen anywhere. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect ever. The ruling invalidated the Missouri Compromise, basically opening the door for slavery to expand across all federal territories westward. Dred Scott himself was an enslaved man who had lived in free territories and sued for his family's freedom legally. The decision is widely considered the worst Supreme Court ruling ever and helped accelerate the Civil War within just 4 years. 59. Long hair on men was banned in New Haven Colony starting in 1656 as supposedly uncivil and deeply unmanly behavior overall. Puritan leaders considered flowing locks a vain Catholic style associated with Charles II and other terrible European royalty. Constables actually inspected men's heads in public, ordering offenders to get haircuts immediately or face fines and community shaming. The law inspired neighboring Massachusetts to declare long hair a violation of biblical instructions, despite Jesus himself being depicted with long hair. Puritans somehow ignored that contradiction, focusing instead on policing the hairlines of every working colonial farmer within town limits. 60. The Immigration Act of 1924 set ethnic quotas using the 1890 census specifically to keep Italians, Jews, and Slavs out of America. Lawmakers chose the older census deliberately because newer numbers reflected the recent waves of Southern and Eastern European immigration arriving constantly. The quotas favored Northern Europeans heavily, allowing tens of thousands of British and German immigrants while almost completely blocking Greeks and Poles. Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany later got rejected under these quotas, with thousands dying because America refused to raise the limits. President Calvin Coolidge signed the bill declaring America must remain American, which everyone understood meant white and Protestant specifically. 61. Mining companies can still extract gold and silver from federal land for just $5 an acre thanks to the 1872 mining law. The statute was written to encourage westward settlement during the gold rush era and somehow never got meaningfully updated since. Modern corporations exploit the loophole to mine billions in precious metals from public lands while paying basically pocket change. Taxpayers receive zero royalties from the extraction, unlike oil and gas operations that pay substantial federal fees regularly. Environmental cleanup costs from abandoned mines have meanwhile reached tens of billions, leaving American taxpayers stuck with the massive bill. 62. Pennsylvania punished adultery with 21 lashes and a full year of hard labor under colonial law passed in 1700. Quaker lawmakers considered marital infidelity a serious crime, threatening the moral fabric of their carefully designed religious community. Both men and women faced identical punishments, which was actually progressive compared to most colonies blaming women exclusively for sexual sins. Public whippings drew massive crowds, with constables counting each lash carefully while the convicted offender screamed for forgiveness loudly. Repeat offenders sometimes got branded with the letter A on their foreheads, basically inspiring Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel Generations Later. 63. Importing enslaved people became federally illegal in 1808, but the domestic slave trade then exploded into a massive interstate industry. The Constitution had blocked Congress from banning the importation for 20 years, which is genuinely horrifying when you actually think about it. Once foreign imports stopped, slaveholders started breeding enslaved people specifically for sale to plantations across the expanding cotton-growing South. Families got ripped apart at auction blocks, with children sold away from mothers and husbands separated from wives forever. The internal slave trade displaced roughly 1 million enslaved Americans, basically turning human trafficking into America's largest interstate commerce business. 64. Wyoming Territory granted women jury duty in 1870, and the judge had to publicly defend the radical decision to a furious nation. Eastern newspapers mocked the territory mercilessly, predicting women jurors would faint at gory evidence or vote based on emotional sympathy. The first female jurors actually delivered serious verdicts efficiently, surprising critics and earning grudging respect from the local Wyoming legal community. Some male defendants requested all-male juries anyway, but the territorial Supreme Court refused, upholding women's right to serve fully. Wyoming became known as the Equality State, leading the nation on women's rights decades before the rest of America caught up. 65. Vermont became the first place in America to ban adult slavery through its founding constitution, adopted in 1777 during the Revolution. The document declared no male over 21 and no female over 18 could be held as enslaved property within Vermont. Children of enslaved people remained technically enslaved until adulthood, which created an awkward loophole nobody really wanted to talk about much. Enforcement was inconsistent, and a few cases of enslavement actually continued quietly in Vermont well into the early 1800s. Still, Vermont set the moral precedent that other northern states gradually followed, eventually eliminating slavery across the entire region completely. 66. The Missouri Compromise drew a line straight across America in 1820, making slavery legal below and banned above the latitude line. Henry Clay engineered the deal to admit Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state simultaneously, balancing congressional power. The compromise held tensions together for 30 years before completely falling apart under the pressure of westward territorial expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 essentially repealed the line, allowing settlers to decide slavery themselves through popular sovereignty voting. That decision triggered Bleeding Kansas violence, foreshadowing the Civil War and proving compromise over slavery was ultimately impossible to maintain peacefully. 67. Massachusetts published the first American law code in 1648 called the Laws and Liberties, including death for blasphemy among many capital crimes. Cursing God, denying the Trinity, or mocking Scripture could send a colonist directly to the gallows under the strict new code. The document also covered everyday matters like property, contracts, and inheritance, basically inventing modern American legal codification practices early. Other colonies copied its format and substance widely, spreading Puritan legal philosophy throughout the entire developing English colonial system. Blasphemy executions remained rare in practice, but the law's existence shaped how generations of Americans thought about religion's relationship to government power. 68. Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution gave the vote to any taxpaying man regardless of race, then revoked it completely in 1838. Free black men had voted in Pennsylvania for 60 years, helping elect officials and shaping the early democratic political system. White voters in the 1830s grew increasingly hostile as free black populations expanded, pushing lawmakers toward openly discriminatory voting restrictions quickly. The 1838 Constitutional Convention added the word white before the word freeman, effectively erasing black voting rights with one stroke. Black men would not regain the vote in Pennsylvania until the 15th Amendment passed nationally over 30 long years later in 1870. 69. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 free acres to settlers, but specifically excluded anyone who had borne arms against the United States. The exclusion targeted Confederate veterans, denying them access to free Western land while their Union counterparts collected farms across the prairies. Confederate sympathizers fumed for years, eventually getting the restriction lifted after Reconstruction wound down through political compromise. The act distributed roughly 270 million acres total, basically populating the entire Great Plains region with European immigrant farmers seeking opportunity. Native Americans whose land was being given away to white settlers received absolutely nothing through this massive federal giveaway program. 70. The Naturalization Act of 1798 extended residency requirements for citizenship from 5 to 14 years, specifically to keep French sympathizers out. Federalists feared French refugees were spreading dangerous revolutionary ideas, undermining American government through radical political organizing in major eastern cities. The law made it nearly impossible for French immigrants to naturalize quickly, effectively blocking them from voting in upcoming federal elections. Thomas Jefferson called the act a partisan attack on immigrants, promising repeal if his Democratic-Republican Party won the 1800 presidential election. Jefferson kept his word, and Congress restored the original 5-year residency requirement, ending one of the earliest American immigration debates. 71. Massachusetts banned people from marrying their deceased wife's sister starting in 1851, which sounds completely random until you understand the context. The law was actually inspired by ongoing British religious debates about whether such marriages violated biblical incest restrictions written in Leviticus. Widowed husbands often relied on sisters-in-law to help raise motherless children, sometimes developing genuine romantic relationships through close daily proximity. Lawmakers considered these marriages morally suspicious, basically treating them like soft incest, despite no actual blood relationship existing between the parties. The ban created bizarre legal tangles for grieving families, and Massachusetts finally repealed the restriction decades later after widespread public mockery. 72. North Carolina forbade any free black person from preaching in public until the state finally lifted the restriction in 1868. Lawmakers passed the ban after the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, fearing black preachers might inspire similar uprisings throughout the South. Free black ministers had been leading congregations for decades, building entire spiritual communities that white authorities suddenly viewed as genuine security threats. The law forced churches underground, with services held secretly in homes, woods, and barns to avoid arrest by patrolling local sheriffs. Black preachers risked whippings and imprisonment, but many continued anyway, basically becoming spiritual outlaws, keeping their communities alive through pure determination and brave faith. 73. Texas Rangers operated for decades under laws allowing them to kill suspects without trial along the Mexican border region. The Rangers earned a fearsome reputation for racial violence, particularly against Mexican Americans called Tejanos, who had lived in Texas for generations. Historians estimate Rangers killed several thousand Tejanos between 1910 and 1920 alone, often without any meaningful legal consequences whatsoever. Bodies sometimes turned up in remote areas, with families afraid to even ask questions about what had actually happened to them. The state legislature eventually held hearings in 1919, exposing widespread Ranger abuses, though most perpetrators escaped accountability through political connections and protective silence. 74. The Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903 banned immigrants who believed in abolishing government, and Emma Goldman got deported under it in 1919. Goldman was a famous Russian Jewish anarchist who had lived in America for over 30 years, organizing workers and writing fierce essays. Authorities specifically targeted her after she opposed World War I conscription, basically using the law to silence her relentless political activism. She was shipped to Russia, along with 248 other radicals during the post-war Red Scare panic sweeping through America. Goldman hated Soviet communism almost as much as American capitalism, eventually criticizing Lenin's government and leaving for permanent European exile abroad. 75. New York's 1907 disorderly conduct law became a favorite weapon for arresting gay men loitering in public bathrooms across the city. Police regularly stationed officers in subway restrooms and parks, entrapping men who responded to subtle signals from undercover decoys deliberately. Convictions destroyed careers, marriages, and reputations, with newspapers publishing the names of arrested men in humiliating public crime reports. Some defendants lost teaching licenses, government jobs, or professional credentials based on a single disorderly conduct conviction stemming from these stings. The harassment continued for decades until activists challenged the practice in the 1960s, eventually forcing police to stop the entrapment operations. 76. Margaret Sanger was arrested in 1916 for opening America's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, serving immigrant women desperately needing options. She had watched her own mother die exhausted after 18 pregnancies, convincing Sanger that contraception was a fundamental human right for women. The clinic operated for just 9 days before police raided it, arresting Sanger and seizing all her medical pamphlets and supplies immediately. She spent 30 days in jail and used the publicity to launch a nationwide birth control movement that eventually became Planned Parenthood. Her work helped overturn Comstock laws criminalizing contraception, though her complicated legacy includes troubling early support for eugenic ideas widely criticized today. 77. American immigration ran on national origin quotas, openly favoring Northern Europeans, until Congress finally scrapped the system in 1965. The Hart-Celler Act replaced ethnic preferences with family reunification and skilled worker categories, transforming American demographics over subsequent decades dramatically. Supporters claimed the law would barely change immigration patterns, predictions that turned out spectacularly wrong as new waves arrived from Asia and Latin America. Within 50 years, the foreign-born population shifted from mostly European to majority Latin American and Asian origin overall. The 1965 Act basically created modern multicultural America, reversing 4 decades of explicit racial preferences that had defined federal immigration policy completely. 78. The Judiciary Act of 1789 made federal judges appointable for life, which is still very much enforced today across America. The founders wanted judges insulated from political pressure, believing lifetime tenure would encourage independent rulings based purely on law and precedent. Critics argue lifetime appointments now produce ancient judges serving into their 90s, sometimes losing mental sharpness while still deciding consequential national cases. Supreme Court justices serve average terms exceeding 25 years, basically allowing presidents to shape law for generations through individual appointments. The system has survived countless reform proposals, though debates over term limits and mandatory retirement ages continue heating up periodically across both political parties. 79. Massachusetts banned the Wampanoag language in Christian praying towns starting in 1675 during the brutal King Philip's War period. Authorities forced Wampanoag converts to speak only English during religious services, schooling, and daily community life within the segregated settlements. The policy aimed to erase native culture entirely, basically completing through language suppression what military violence had started during the devastating war. Generations of Wampanoag children grew up unable to speak their ancestral language, severing connections to traditions stretching back thousands of years. Modern Wampanoag activists have spent decades reviving the language, producing dictionaries and teaching kids the words their grandparents were forbidden to learn. 80. South Carolina's Negro Seaman Act of 1822 jailed any free black sailor entering Charleston Harbor until his ship finally departed. The law passed after the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion plot, with lawmakers fearing free black sailors might inspire enslaved Carolinians to revolt similarly. British and Northern sailors got hauled to jail straight off their ships, costing their employers wages and creating massive diplomatic problems. Britain protested formally, calling the law a violation of international maritime agreements and basic human rights of foreign nationals working legally. South Carolina refused to back down for decades, defying both federal court rulings and international pressure until the Civil War finally ended it. 81. Railroads scored 10 square miles of public land for every single mile of track laid under the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. Congress wanted to encourage transcontinental railroad construction, basically handing private corporations one of the largest land transfers in American history overall. Companies received roughly 175 million acres total, which is larger than the entire state of Texas put together. Railroad executives sold the land to settlers, mined it for resources, and harvested timber, making fortunes off former federal property. Native tribes who actually lived on much of that land received absolutely nothing, watching their homelands disappear into corporate ownership overnight. 82. Tennessee passed a poll tax in 1870 that disenfranchised both poor whites and black voters, becoming the model copied across the South. Lawmakers required citizens to pay before voting, deliberately pricing out working-class Americans who could barely afford basic groceries each week. Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia quickly adopted similar laws, combining poll taxes with literacy tests and grandfather clauses to maximize voter suppression efforts. Black turnout collapsed across the South, dropping by 90% in some states within just a single generation after Reconstruction officially ended. Congress finally banned poll taxes in federal elections through the 24th Amendment in 1964, though states tried other suppression tactics immediately afterward. 83. Women got stuck with 10-hour workday limits after Mueller v. Oregon in 1908, based on women supposedly being weaker than men. Future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis filed a famous brief packed with social science, arguing women needed special protection from harsh factory conditions. Justices agreed unanimously, citing women's delicate constitutions and their crucial role producing healthy future American children for the growing nation. This ruling sounded progressive, but actually justified excluding women from higher-paying jobs requiring longer hours throughout the early 20th century. Feminist legal scholars later criticized the decision, arguing protective laws often locked women out of opportunities men freely accessed through workplaces. 84. Andrew Jackson forced the Trail of Tears through the Indian Removal Act of 1830, even after the Supreme Court ruled the policy illegal. Chief Justice John Marshall sided with the Cherokee Nation in Worcester versus Georgia, declaring tribes were sovereign and protected from state interference. Jackson allegedly responded that Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it, and proceeded with removal anyway across the South. Roughly 16,000 Cherokee got forced westward to Oklahoma, with about 4,000 dying from disease, starvation, and brutal winter exposure conditions. Presidential defiance of the Supreme Court here remains one of the most flagrant violations of constitutional separation of powers in American history. 85. Slavery officially ended through the 13th Amendment in 1865, except as punishment for a crime, leaving a loophole still embedded in the Constitution. Southern states immediately exploited the exception, passing vagrancy laws and black codes designed to arrest freed people for minor invented offenses. Convicts got leased to plantations, mines, and railroads, performing brutal forced labor under conditions sometimes worse than actual antebellum slavery itself. Convict leasing killed thousands of black prisoners through neglect, disease, and outright violence over the following several brutal decades nationwide. Modern activists point to mass incarceration as the loophole's lasting legacy, with prison labor still legally permitted under the same constitutional language today. 86. American ships got banned from all foreign trade under the Embargo Act of 1807, basically devastating the entire New England maritime economy overnight. President Thomas Jefferson hoped the embargo would pressure Britain and France into respecting American shipping rights during the ongoing Napoleonic Wars period. Instead, American merchants went bankrupt, sailors lost jobs, and smugglers immediately took over coastal trade with Canadian ports operating cheerfully nearby. New England nearly seceded from the Union, with Federalist newspapers calling Jefferson a tyrant, destroying the country to please his French sympathies allegedly. Congress repealed the disastrous law just before Jefferson left office, marking one of the worst economic policy failures in early American history. 87. Reconstruction-era civil rights guarantees got effectively neutralized when the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 gutted 14th Amendment protections for nearly a century. Louisiana butchers had sued over a state monopoly law, arguing the amendment protected their right to pursue lawful occupations freely. Justices ruled narrowly, declaring the amendment only protected federal citizenship rights, not state-level protections that mattered most to ordinary Americans. This ruling effectively allowed states to discriminate against black citizens for decades, undermining the entire constitutional framework Reconstruction Republicans had carefully designed. Legal scholars consider Slaughterhouse among the worst Supreme Court decisions ever, alongside Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson on shameful lists. 88. Massachusetts taxpayers funded congregational ministers through public taxes from 1697 until disestablishment finally happened in 1833 after long political fights. This arrangement basically created a state church, with everyone required to support Protestant clergy regardless of personal religious beliefs or denominational membership. Baptists, Quakers, and Catholics fought the system for over a century, refusing to pay and sometimes facing property seizures from town officials. While the First Amendment supposedly banned established religion federally, states could still maintain their own arrangements until disestablishment movements gradually succeeded statewide. Massachusetts was actually the very last state to disestablish its official church, ending nearly 2 centuries of compelled religious taxation in America. 89. Virginia households had to attend Anglican services starting in 1639, or face fines of 100 pounds of tobacco for absences. Tobacco was literal currency in colonial Virginia, making the fine seriously painful for farming families struggling through difficult harvest seasons financially. Church wardens kept attendance lists, reporting absentees to county courts that imposed the heavy fines without much sympathy or flexibility. Dissenters like Baptists faced even harsher treatment, sometimes getting whipped or jailed for preaching unauthorized religious doctrines in private homes secretly. Virginia finally guaranteed religious freedom through Thomas Jefferson's famous Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786, ending nearly a century of compelled Anglican worship. 90. America got forced back onto the gold standard by the Specie Resumption Act of 1875, deepening the brutal Long Depression crushing farmers and workers. Congress wanted to restore confidence in American currency after years of paper money inflation following the Civil War economic disruption. Returning to gold drastically reduced the money supply, making loans harder to repay and crushing debt-strapped farmers across the entire country. Farm prices collapsed, while debt stayed fixed in increasingly valuable gold-backed dollars, basically transferring massive wealth from rural workers to bankers. This act sparked the populist movement, with William Jennings Bryan famously declaring in 1896 that mankind should not be crucified upon a cross of gold. 91. Florida actually made it illegal for free black people to own dogs back in 1832 under territorial law passed by nervous lawmakers. Slaveholders feared free black residents might use dogs to help enslaved people escape or warn them about approaching patrols hunting runaways. Owning even a small lapdog could result in fines, confiscation of the animal, and possible whippings depending on the local enforcement attitudes. Authorities also banned free black people from owning firearms, gathering in groups, or traveling without written passes from white sponsors nearby. Florida's territorial code basically tried suffocating free black life through dozens of petty restrictions, treating pet ownership itself as a potential security threat. 92. Louisiana's Code Noir of 1724 banned Jewish people from the entire colony, expelling families who had lived there for actual generations. French colonial officials wanted to maintain strict Catholic religious uniformity, viewing Jewish residents as a threat to spiritual order and proper colonial governance. Jewish merchants who had established successful businesses suddenly had to abandon homes, livelihoods, and communities they had built over decades of careful work. Many fled to other colonies with more tolerant policies, while some quietly stayed by hiding their religious identity and practicing in secret. Louisiana basically became one of the only American colonies with an explicit ban on Jewish residents, lasting until the Spanish took over. 93. Massachusetts made consulting a familiar spirit an actual capital crime under the 1648 witchcraft statute that fueled the Salem trials later. A familiar spirit was basically a demonic helper, often imagined as a black cat, toad, or other small animal companion. Prosecutors argued that any unusual pet bonding with a suspect counted as evidence of witchcraft requiring immediate execution by hanging rope. Old women living alone with cats faced particular danger, since loneliness plus animal companionship somehow equaled obvious satanic activity to Puritan minds. The statute provided legal cover for the Salem hysteria 44 years later, when 19 people swung from gallows over similar spectral accusations. 94. Congress authorized the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 for just one single year before refusing to provide adequate funding to continue its mission. The Bureau was supposed to help 4 million freed slaves transition into citizenship through education, employment contracts, and basic medical assistance. Underfunded agents tried distributing land, building schools, and resolving labor disputes across the entire war-ravaged South with limited staff. Southern white violence specifically targeted Bureau workers, with the Ku Klux Klan murdering agents and burning down freedmen's schools regularly across the region. President Andrew Johnson actively undermined the agency, vetoing extension bills and basically ensuring Reconstruction would fail through deliberate institutional starvation and neglect. 95. Pennsylvania's Test Act of 1779 required officeholders to renounce King George, which effectively barred pacifist Quakers from serving in government positions. Quakers refused to swear any oaths on religious principle, including loyalty oaths that other Americans gladly took without serious second thoughts. Quakers had basically founded Pennsylvania and dominated colonial government for nearly a century before suddenly getting locked out of political participation. The oath requirement struck them particularly hard because Quakers also refused military service, making them double targets for revolutionary patriot suspicion and hostility. Quaker influence in Pennsylvania politics never fully recovered, with the religious community shifting toward private charity and education rather than active governance. 96. Christian missionaries got paid by the federal government to run boarding schools forcibly, assimilating Native children under the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. Congress allocated annual money for missions teaching English, farming, and Christianity to Native kids ripped from their families against their will. The schools deliberately stripped children of their languages, traditional clothing, sacred names, and any cultural connections to their tribal heritage entirely. Physical abuse, malnutrition, and disease killed thousands of students, with mass graves recently being discovered at multiple former boarding school sites nationwide. Generations of survivors carried devastating trauma, basically losing connections to their tribal cultures while gaining few of the supposed benefits promised by reformers. 97. Hawaii banned teaching school in the Hawaiian language starting in 1896, nearly killing off the entire indigenous tongue within a few generations. American businessmen had overthrown Queen Liliuokalani 3 years earlier, immediately moving to suppress native Hawaiian culture across the islands aggressively afterward. Children caught speaking Hawaiian at school faced beatings, humiliating punishments, and forced lectures about the supposed inferiority of their own ancestral language. The ban lasted nearly a century before Hawaii finally legalized Hawaiian language instruction again in 1986, after decades of cultural revival activism. Fluent speakers had dropped to just a few thousand elderly survivors, but immersion schools have since helped revive the language remarkably. 98. New York banned plays mocking elected officials starting in 1788, basically making political satire a punishable offense across the entire state. Lawmakers had no patience for theatrical critics ridiculing them on stage, viewing such performances as serious threats to public order and proper governance. Playwrights got around the ban by changing character names slightly, presenting obvious caricatures of real politicians while technically following the letter of the restriction. Theater managers occasionally faced fines or temporary closure orders, though enforcement varied wildly depending on which specific politicians were currently being mocked most viciously. The ban faded as free speech protections expanded, but it captured early American discomfort with the satirical traditions that thrive openly today. 99. American-built ships got preferential rates under the Tariff Act of 1789, marking one of the first economic protectionist measures passed by Congress. Founders wanted to encourage domestic shipbuilding, viewing a strong merchant marine as essential for national security and continued economic independence. Foreign ships paid significantly higher duties when docking at American ports, basically subsidizing American shipyards at the expense of European competitors. Shipbuilders boomed in New England, with Massachusetts and Maine yards producing thousands of vessels over the next several profitable decades through this policy. Industry executives basically lobbied successfully for protection from day one of the Republic, establishing patterns of corporate influence that continue shaping American trade policy. 100. Georgia's founding charter of 1735 actually banned both slavery and rum, two prohibitions that lasted barely 15 years before getting fully repealed. Founder James Oglethorpe envisioned Georgia as a moral utopia where debtors could rebuild their lives without alcohol or the corrupting institution of slavery. Settlers immediately complained that competing with slave-holding South Carolina was economically impossible, basically demanding the right to import enslaved labor immediately. Rum smugglers ignored the ban entirely, with taverns operating openly throughout Savannah, despite official prohibitions on the books supposedly enforced by colonial authorities. Both bans collapsed by 1751, transforming Georgia into a standard plantation colony, indistinguishable from its neighbors, and crushing Oglethorpe's idealistic founding vision completely. 101. Pennsylvania colonists faced a 20-shilling fine for playing cards, dice, or lotteries under the 1705 law passed by stern Quaker lawmakers. William Penn's followers considered all forms of gambling spiritually corrupting, treating dice games like genuine threats to community morality and proper Christian living. 20 shillings was painful money back then, roughly equal to a week's wages for an average laboring colonial farmer trying to feed his family. Tavern keepers caught hosting card games faced license revocation, basically losing their entire livelihood over a few harmless rounds of friendly evening entertainment. The law inspired similar restrictions across other colonies, though enforcement was wildly inconsistent, and gamblers simply moved their games into private homes secretly. 102. Pacifist Quakers got barred from Pennsylvania government under the Test Act of 1779, which required office holders to renounce King George officially. Lawmakers wanted absolute loyalty from public servants during the Revolutionary War, demanding oaths that conflicted directly with core Quaker religious principles forever. Quakers refused all formal oaths on biblical grounds, including loyalty pledges that other Americans gladly took without serious second thoughts at all. This effectively locked out the religious community that had basically founded and run Pennsylvania for nearly a century before the Revolution started. Quaker influence in state politics never fully recovered, with the community shifting toward private charity, education, and abolition work rather than governance. 103. Land speculators went absolutely wild after the Land Act of 1820 let federal land be bought for just $1.25 per acre cash. Wealthy investors snapped up millions of acres across the frontier, then resold parcels at massive markups to actual farming families seeking homesteads. Speculation bubbles inflated repeatedly throughout the 19th century, with bank failures and economic panics following each predictable burst of frontier real estate mania. Ordinary settlers often arrived to find prime land already claimed by absent investors holding deeds in distant eastern offices and waiting for prices. The act basically fueled westward expansion while simultaneously concentrating land wealth among speculators, shaping rural inequality patterns lasting for generations afterward. 104. Massachusetts started minting its own pine tree shilling coins in 1652, openly defying England's currency monopoly across the colonial possessions. Colonists desperately needed actual circulating money for trade, since England refused to ship enough coins across the Atlantic to support local commerce. Master craftsman John Hull operated the secret mint in Boston, stamping silver coins featuring a small pine tree symbol representing Massachusetts forests. King Charles II eventually discovered the operation and was furious about colonial defiance of royal monetary authority and prerogative powers. Massachusetts cleverly argued the pine tree was actually an oak, basically gaslighting the king, who eventually let it slide rather than fight openly. 105. America paid Mexico $10 million for 30,000 square miles through the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, specifically to build a southern railroad. Diplomat James Gadsden negotiated the deal, acquiring land across what eventually became southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico for railroad construction routes. Southern politicians wanted a transcontinental rail line passing through slave territory, hoping to strengthen the institution by linking it economically to California. Mexico reluctantly accepted the money, still recovering from losing massive territory just 6 years earlier through the Mexican-American War's devastating peace terms. Civil War interrupted the railroad plans, and the southern route was not actually completed until decades later, under entirely different political circumstances. 106. New Hampshire required every single town to maintain a public whipping post under colonial law passed in 1719 by stern Puritan lawmakers. Authorities used the post to punish drunkards, petty thieves, blasphemers, and basically anyone who annoyed local officials sufficiently to warrant public humiliation. Sentences ranged from a few lashes to dozens, with the convicted offender stripped to the waist and tied securely while the community watched. Children were often brought specifically to witness whippings, treating public punishment as a kind of moral education for the next generation. The posts remained common across New England for over a century before gradually disappearing during the early 19th century reform movements. 107. Silver got demonetized through the Coinage Act of 1873, triggering decades of furious farmer revolts known as the Crime of 73 forever. Congress quietly dropped silver from the official monetary standard, basically restricting American currency to gold alone going forward through this technical legislation. Western miners and indebted farmers howled in protest, arguing that limiting money supply made loans impossibly hard to repay during ongoing economic depression. The populist movement exploded across the plains, demanding bimetallism with William Jennings. Bryan delivering his famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896. Free silver became basically a religious crusade for struggling farmers, though gold standard advocates ultimately won the political battle through urban electoral majorities. 108. Connecticut finally separated church and state in 1818, becoming the last New England colony to officially disestablish its mandatory state church. Congregationalists had dominated Connecticut government for nearly 2 centuries, with taxpayers compelled to fund Protestant ministers regardless of personal religious beliefs nearby. Baptists, Episcopalians, and Methodists organized politically to demand religious freedom, eventually forming a coalition that finally pushed through constitutional reform statewide. The new constitution guaranteed equal treatment for all Christian denominations, though Jewish and Catholic communities still faced informal discrimination throughout the broader society. Connecticut's disestablishment basically completed the long American journey toward religious freedom that had started with Roger Williams way back in 1636. 109. Armed farmers freed neighbors arrested by federal marshals during Fry's Rebellion, sparked by the unpopular direct tax of 1798 across rural Pennsylvania. The federal government had imposed property taxes on homes, land, and even enslaved people, hitting struggling Pennsylvania German farmers particularly hard financially. Auctioneer John Fries led roughly 400 armed men to free tax resistors from a Bethlehem tavern where marshals were holding them captive. Federal troops eventually crushed the uprising, with Fries himself convicted of treason and sentenced to hang for leading the popular armed resistance movement. President John Adams pardoned Fries just before execution, though the rebellion damaged Federalist popularity and helped Jefferson win the next presidential election easily. 110. Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1865 that gave Black Americans citizenship, but Congress overrode him and passed the historic law anyway. Radical Republicans had drafted the bill specifically to counter Southern black codes that were basically recreating slavery under different legal terminology. Johnson called the legislation an unconstitutional federal overreach, defending states' rights to discriminate against newly freed people without any federal interference. Congress overrode his veto by exactly the required 2/3 majority, marking the first major presidential veto override in entire American history. The act laid groundwork for the 14th Amendment and basically established Congress could protect civil rights against hostile state governments through federal legislation. 111. Former Confederates got their political rights restored through the Amnesty Act of 1872, except for a few hundred top Confederate leaders excluded specifically. Roughly 150,000 ex-Confederates regained voting rights and eligibility for public office, basically rejoining American political life after 7 years. The act marked the end of meaningful Reconstruction-era restrictions, allowing former rebels to retake control of Southern state governments through the ballot box. Within just a few years, Redeemer Democrats had dismantled Reconstruction protections across the South, ushering in the brutal Jim Crow era that followed. President Ulysses Grant signed the bill hoping for national reconciliation, but it basically guaranteed Black Americans would lose civil rights for nearly a century. And there you have it. 111 absurd old American laws that would basically make every single one of us hardened criminals today. From banning Christmas in Boston to outlawing checkers between friends in Alabama, our ancestors truly had wild priorities. If your jaw dropped even once during this entire ridiculous journey, smash that like button immediately and let us know your favorite absurd law down in the comments below. Subscribe to Dumb History right now for more insane stories that your school textbooks somehow forgot to mention. Hit that notification bell too, because trust me, history gets way weirder from here on out. See you next time.